Morning, everybody. This is Truth Seeker here. It's been a few weeks since I've posted anything on YouTube. I had made a short video at that time, about 3 weeks ago, giving an idea of some of the things that I've been interested in and have been studying a bit. One of them being the topic of shunning, because this is central, such a central aspect of Jehovah's Witness life. In fact, actually, it's a central aspect of life altogether. People experience ostracism in many different ways in their life by the individuals closest to them. And I wanted to know a little more about the power of ostracism, the power of shunning, why people shun, its effects on individuals, especially the effects, because time and time again over the years, I've noticed how shunning as a repeated theme arises among certain religious communities, such as the Jehovah's Witnesses. Certainly, it's a part of Scientology. They call it disconnecting. The Amish are well reputed for their shunning practices, as well as the Mormons. Many religions, Christian religions, use shunning as a means of manipulating people, as a means of getting the laity of the organization, keeping them in line, keeping a matter of control over them. That really is the bottom line. I mean, if there wasn't some factor to shunning that had implications and worked, shunning wouldn't be used. So I became very curious about what those factors are. And it turns out that shunning is a very powerful mechanism to manipulate and to coerce individuals to capitulate on a point of, let's say, disagreement between individuals. And I began doing a search about a month ago online with regard to the topic of shunning. And I found repeatedly that one name in particular came up in this area of psychological study, and his name is Kipling Williams. And I purchased his book, Ostracism: The Power of Silence, by Kipling Williams. Now, he's been interviewed on YouTube. You can find YouTube videos. What he has to say is very interesting. Much of what he has written about in this book doesn't deal with institutional ostracism, such as is the case with the Jehovah's Witnesses, where it's an official policy of the religion, but he deals with the emotions, the psychological effect, the impact on people who are ostracized, who are shunned, and he looks at the short-term and the long-term impacts of shunning. I think he was the first really to take a look at this matter as a key focus of study. There have been others who followed him. I just saw a video on the John Cedars channel that dealt with the subject, the shunning. Um, I actually had contacted Lloyd for as I was doing my research because I saw an example of some of the psychological effects at work in one of his videos, and I asked him if I could use a clip. And I don't know if that had anything to do with his uh, interview today that he opened up today or last night. I don't know when it was with this young man who's studying shunning, but I think it's an important area to look at, especially for Jehovah's Witnesses, because anybody who leaves the Jehovah's Witnesses today is going to experience ostracism. They're going to experience shunning. And shunning is very, very powerful. Actually, Kipling Williams, or Kip Williams, opens his book with a a personal experience he had uh, with um, with a matter of just chance. He was walking his dog in a park, and he was minding his own business. And yeah, I guess he had a blanket out. And he was enjoying the good weather outdoors with his dog. And two fellows were um, throwing frisbees, throwing a frisbee back, tossing it back and forth, and somehow the frisbee got out of control and it hit him in the back. So he picked up the frisbee and, in a friendly manner, tossed it back, and to his surprise, they tossed it back to him again. So it ended up sort of a threesome. And so this went on for a couple of minutes where they were tossing it between the three of them. And suddenly, without explanation, they stopped tossing it to Kip. And he just stood there waiting, and the frisbee never came. And he started to feel awkward. And then he realized that he was never going to get that frisbee again. And he felt terrible being left out. And so he made a show of, well, I don't care. And he directed his attention back to his dog, and he didn't let on, or at least he tried to not let on, that his feelings were hurt and that he felt badly by this incident. And he thought, why should I feel badly? Why? He didn't know these two individuals. Why did he have such an overpowering feeling of loss of self esteem and the power that that had over him to be left out? And he thought this would be a very, very interesting way of studying the social interaction of ostracism. And so he this certain circumstance with the frisbee inspired Kip to formulate simulations in an experimental mode, um, to study the impacts of the effects of shunning. And it turned out that the power of shunning was far more extreme in its implications, psychological implications, than he ever would have thought. Everybody's experienced shunning to some extent. Ostracism. Shunning's just another form of ostracism. Shunning is a more of an institutional, official way of casting somebody out of a group. And but we all experience ostracism or shunning to some extent. The silent treatment is one of the forms in which people on a one-on-one scale, many relationships, especially very dysfunctional relationships, will use shunning, use ostracism, use the silent treatment to gain power or manipulation over other people in their lives. And if there wasn't some benefit to shunning, it wouldn't be used. If there were no very distinguishable outcomes that met the objectives of the people who do the shunning wouldn't be used. The silent treatment wouldn't be used. And I know from a personal experience that I've been shunned, that I've been um, ostracized, and the overwhelming, for the first time in my life after I began looking into this matter, did I understand some of the most powerful and moving aspects of my life. One had to deal with our Bible students' ecclesia and the rejection that I felt when I was at an age where I was put up for elder, uh, to be an elder in the ecclesia, to be a teacher, a leader, a recognized leader, and that is one of the sorts of rites of passage for a young man in the Bible students movement. We're raised to believe that any young man of any kind of value, of any kind of intellectual value, will be an elder in one of the ecclesias that they end up associating with. In my case, it was the ecclesia that I was born and raised in. Bible students do move. I mean, just as every other um, American, most Americans do move from the place that they were born and into other locations. So uh, there are many opportunities to become an elder in other ecclesias as your profession takes you to other places of the country. But that wasn't the case with me. I moved back to New Jersey. I went to college, and focusing in on college in my 20s, I I had my hands full. I went to school with a family. I had two daughters when I went to college. My wife, she put a roof over our heads. I contributed to the work of the Dawn Bible students. She was the cook for the Dawn Bible students, and we had a small apartment and a stipend, $150 a month stipend. I didn't get the stipend, but she did, and this was an arrangement that was agreed upon managing editor. Wow, something went wrong there. I'm sorry. The managing editor of the Dawn Bible Students. And this, this arrangement was not established with just me, but with other young couples that were interested in serving at the Dawn. And he was more of a progressive type of manager. He had a Harvard business school education before he had become a Bible student, and his wife was responsible for converting him into the Bible students. And so he had quite a bit of quite an accomplished individual before he had joined the Bible students. And he had gone on to become the managing editor of the Dawn. And he realized that in today's society, it was becoming increasingly tough to make a living, to support a family without a college education. So he was making arrangements with other young people, couples, where one that had a skill that was necessary for the Dawn. He would permit the other spouse to attend college if they were serious about getting a degree, and he wouldn't pay for the college, but he would allow that person to attend college and then do whatever work that was available around the Dawn uh, in their free time, in their spare time, like summertime when and winter vacation around Christmas when the colleges in between semesters and so on when the college was in session. A couple of young people, including myself, had taken advantage of this circumstance, and he was very supportive of anybody who very unusual in that regard, to support a young person who was interested in advancing their education. So I took advantage of that, and in return, I didn't expect that because I was really devoting my attention, all my time. I was even taking summer classes to try to accelerate my graduation. Uh, I didn't expect to be able to take on the responsibilities of an elder, and I didn't, you know, really expect to be nominated. Bible students do vote in their elders and their deacons, which in Jehovah's Witness world would be ministerial servants, guys that hold the microphones or stand up in front and wave their hand back and forth during the singing. Um, I was a ministerial servant during the times when I was in college, and during that period, I did give some talks, um, but not too many. It came about maybe once or twice a year that I would give a discourse or a talk. I was really focused on school. But after I graduated college, I fully expected to jump in with both feet into the work, into the Bible students. It was an expectation. It was something that we were raised all our lives to believe. It was a sense of how we valued ourselves. And we had our annual elections as normal every October, and my name was put up for nomination for eldership. And beside my wife, I didn't get a single vote. And another young man, individual, whose name came up for the first time, uh, this individual was noted for some very odd behavior. He would burst out. I don't. I think he may have been an undiagnosed Tourette's syndrome. I remember one time this individual punched the wall. He had a very low tolerance for frustration, and he punched the wall, breaking his finger in compound ways. His pinky finger, and it broke it. Really smashed it. It needed surgery to repair. But as he punched the wall, he screamed, "I hate this Bible shit." And he also had a habit of rubbing his crotch when nervous. And he would do so as he was standing in front of the class or the ecclesia giving a talk, or when he led the singing. It was kind of an embarrassing spectacle, but I don't think he was doing it consciously. He just had this strange, aberrant behavior, and this individual was unanimously voted in as an elder, and we were both about the same age at the time, and it was piercing. There was this overwhelming blackness. It is really something that's so hard for me to describe because it was so all encompassing. It penetrated every fiber of my soul, and it was the realization of the rejection that was expressed without any explanation. This it was ostracism. It was the silent treatment. I never understood what the matter was. But I remember the day afterwards, the all consuming feeling of worthlessness, of low self esteem. And my wife, she saw how consuming this circumstance was for me, and tried to comfort me. We couldn't even eat at home. I had to get out. I didn't want to be with people. I wanted to be away. I was so consumed by this feeling of rejection. And and I didn't understand it at the time. And my wife said, uh, "There'll be a time in your life that you're glad that this happened." She was right, ultimately. But at the time, you know, thinking that we had the truth, and I was being rejected by the truth brethren, was something that almost couldn't take. The feeling was so powerful, and so I understand it. I also had another experience as a young man where the relationship I had with my parents was not very good. Well, my mother had sexually abused me, and I always had a very, very difficult time with her. Um, I didn't necessarily understand it at the time it occurred. I was just a child, but I had this feeling of repulsion for her my entire life that never subsided. I never felt comfortable around her. And so I never really tried to foster much of a relationship. There were times when I felt guilty about the feelings I had about her, and I would try to establish a relationship with her. But most often, I really didn't want to have much to do with her. But on the other hand, I needed my father. I needed him because of the fact that I really didn't. My mother was not something that was a positive factor in my life. Yet my father didn't really want anything to do with me, especially in my teen years when I began rejecting the truth, when I began rejecting our religion and the demanding, the unreasonable demands that they placed on your life, the meetings, uh, the values, the expectations, the behavior, the culture was all. Your whole life was absorbed into this way of life that was intrusive, and and it controlled every element of how you behaved and how you lived. Your family wasn't just your nuclear family, but everybody knew what was going on in everybody else's family. It was such a small religion that it was there was a there was this very tight knit community between them. I mean, our Bible student class in New York was one of the larger ones, and I don't think it exceeded 140 or so members, even at its largest when I was a child. Um, when I was a young adult, seeking eldership, repenting from the sins of my youth, my teenage years, um, the class was about 45, 50 strong on a Sunday. So it was considerably smaller. And today I understand there are just a handful of members in that class. I think the New York class has maybe about 14 or so individuals that meet together. But the I our family was never very close. I was never very close with my brothers growing up. My two younger brothers teamed up against me often. They had separate friends. I made separate friends. We just were a very separate family. My father never really showed a tremendous amount of interest in us boys. When we were very, very young, he used to take us out for walks down the railroad track behind our house. But it wasn't a busy rail. It was the train would come once a day or twice a day. That was, it wasn't it wasn't a commuter rail line. Out in it was a rural area at the time, and we would walk a mile down the tracks when he would come home from work in the summer, and come back. But there wasn't really much. Sometimes he took us fishing, but there wasn't a whole lot. I mean, mostly uh, our family life centered around the things that my parents wanted to do, which involved the Bible students' conventions, meetings, speaking assignments, because my father was an elder, and sometimes that would require him leaving for a whole weekend, and he'd take me along. And I wanted a relationship in my teens. I wanted to start fostering a relationship with my brothers, especially my younger brother, because at the time I felt that we were the two most distant in the family. And I took him camping. I was probably 19, and he would have been 15, I guess. He's 4 years younger than me. And we did some camping up on the Delaware River. And I tried to I was reaching out. I was reaching out to make some family bonds because they were so missing in our family. Our family was so tremendously dysfunctional, and and the dysfunction always felt like it was coming from us three because us boys were rejecting the controlling attitude of the family. And so our parents didn't pay too much attention to us. And so I would reach out to my father. Now, my father and mother had close friends, especially with the young people and the Bible students. And we weren't, at the time when I was about 19, I'd begun pulling back from attending meetings. And I had bought a raft from the Army Navy store, local Army Navy store. This was a military raft that was used for survival purposes, and I would take it up to the Delaware River and go shoot the rapids. And I thought, gee, my dad would really like this, and so I prearranged a a um, a trip, a rafting trip with him. We lived about an hour from the Delaware River, and I wanted to plan a day where it was just he and I. We could bond a little. And I was the one that was reaching out. I've tried on a number of occasions to do so, and they never worked out. But I thought here my dad would really enjoy this, and so my dad he usually spent, if he wasn't tied up with some Bible student business, he would spend his free time working on the house, painting it. It was his big project, and he fixing things up and wallpapering. They bought this 1870s home that was really dilapidated, and it was very depressing to be in the place. It had one grid, 3 by 3 grid heater in the living room floor that pumped out hot air convection, and that was supposed to heat this entire house. Um, and it wasn't sufficient. I mean, if I left my door closed in my bedroom, I could freeze a glass of water in my room, and it happened a few times. We had to sleep with the doors open, or else we didn't get the heat. But there wasn't. It was just one 3 by 3 foot grate on the floor in the living room that pumped out the heat, and it just dispersed throughout the house. That's how old this place was, and it used to be a coal furnace. It was converted into an oil furnace. Well, my dad was painting the house on the day that I had already prearranged with him to go rafting. And I said, Dad, I thought we were going rafting today. And he says, yeah, later. And it was late August. The days were already beginning to get shorter. It wasn't dark till 8 or 9 o'clock anymore. It was getting dark at 7:30, and you needed to get off because we would we had to park the car, pump up the raft, get down to the river, sail down the river a ways, and then walk back to the car. And that would take, that actually, to have any kind of a boat ride of significance, we really should have gotten off earlier during the day. But and I kept on him, and finally he, in a very annoyed way, he looked very annoyed. Stop bothering me. He finally capitulated. By then it was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. He had painted the entire day that we had scheduled to set aside to do the rafting. And so we drove up, and I pumped up the raft, and we went down the river together, but we could only go maybe a mile or so because the darkness was coming down on us. It was so late in the afternoon that we got off that we really couldn't take much of a ride. And he loved it. He loved it. But what I found out was he didn't love it with me. He just loved the experience. Like I said, they had fostered close relationships with other young people in the ecclesia. And after we got back to the car, and actually I broke my foot climbing up a 200-foot cliff to get back. We had to pull out of the river and climb this. It was almost a vertical slope back up to the road, and then walk back about a mile and a half to the car. By the time we got back to the car, it was pitch black. It was dark. That's how late in the afternoon it was. But as we climbed this thing, I broke a bone in my foot, and I limped all the way back. And it wasn't the day that I expected. Especially, I was very disappointed because I knew that he really I cajoled, I guess coerced him by my consistent nagging to go rafting with him. To to uh, that that that's what kind of induced him to come with me. So I didn't get the satisfaction that what I had hoped was that we could improve our relationship. It didn't happen. But on the way home, he had so enjoyed the experience. He asked if he could borrow my raft the next weekend, and I said sure. And I didn't know exactly what he had in mind, but he asked to borrow it for the next weekend. So he did, and he invited a young couple, married couple. They were a few years older than me, uh, and they went rafting the entire day that following weekend. They spent an entire day going down the Delaware River. They brought two cars, and they went some probably 5 or 6 miles down the river, maybe more, and went back to the car. But he didn't even ask for me to come along. Would I like to come? And I felt awful being left out. Here it was my raft. It was my idea, and it hurt. It hurt tremendously that he'd rather be with these young people than with me. And at the time, they went off with these friends, a young couple in their early 20s, and I was with my girlfriend the next weekend, and and I told her how badly I hurt being left out, and my father didn't want to be with me. And that through later experiences, I realized that was truly how he felt. He didn't feel any closeness to me at all. I mean, our family was really pretty dysfunctional. Uh, my father, uh, he wouldn't pay taxes. He had liens on his pay because he wouldn't pay his taxes. My dad had issues. He was not the great person that he projected himself to be in front of the Bible students class. He was two people. He was the Bible student, the great guy, the had a great sense of humor, could approach him with anything at meeting, but at home he was distant, angry. He didn't feel any closeness to us boys at all. We were trouble, and I when my brother was 16 and ran away from home, he was just as happy with that as anything. I would be extremely distressed if my 16-year-old ran away from home. I'd call every police department uh, up and down the East Coast to about my son. And back then, they didn't have the kind of police national internetworking that they have today. So you could leave and nobody would find you. There was no national system reporting for missing persons. So my brother did get sent back. He got caught down in Orlando, or not Orlando, Daytona Beach. He had hitchhiked with 50 cents in his pocket at 16 years old to Daytona Beach, and he shoplifted a toothbrush, got caught, arrested, and sent back home. And my father was mad that he had to pay for the airfare. He thought the police should pay for the airfare. But as he would relate that story years later, he was so proud of his youngest son to take that initiative to strike out on his own, and my brother wasn't anywhere near the maturity level to take care of himself. So we grew up in a family where the Bible and the Bible students and the religion was number one in our parents' um, interests, and us boys were just consequences that were expected to follow along. That we were expected to just accept the truth and grow up, and they didn't have to put any effort into raising us. And it led to a family that really didn't communicate with one another. So in a sense, we had sort of an ostracism within the family in its own right. But I was really, really hurt by the fact that he didn't invite me rafting, and I had introduced him to this, and it was very painful. And then I had to I rationalized it, and I said, well, I made it possible for him to enjoy the time with their good friends, and so I was a catalyst in that. And even if I wasn't a part of it, I did something good for my father. But that was I have to admit it was very painful. So these are certain experiences that I have had where rejection and ostracism have been key factors in my life, and I really do understand how it affects and impacts your sense of who you are, your sense of worth. If other people don't value your worth, then you don't value yourself. A lot of our sense of self-esteem is is obtained, especially if we're not given a very strong sense of self-esteem. If we're taught that what others think is paramount, And if we're raised with that idea, then when we're rejected by those whose opinion is paramount to our sense of who we are, then when we're rejected and given the silent treatment, not being told the reasons why you're not being elected an elder, uh, you just default to the I'm worthless. I'm just a worthless person. And that was what was the all-consuming factor in my in that particular experience. And so, I planned actually to deal with this subject more of in a topical way in several I guess several videos, because there's so much in here. I mean, in this study, I mean, Kip Williams was the first to model the the um, the effects and the mechanism, how the psychological effects of the of shunning, of ostracism, and what it actually affects. And in the book, he presents this model in chapter 3. You can see that diagram there. And one of the things that is really key to the whole thing is that uh, what does it do to us? There are motives behind ostracism. There are levels of ostracism, degrees to which it is applied. Um, there are the certain attributions that kind of modify the impacts. But what it does is it affects four essential human needs. And the needs really are the sense of belonging, self esteem, a sense of control, and a sense of meaningful existence. And these are very, very fundamental, very critical elements of our lives, of who we are as individuals. And as as he as he began his studies in ostracism, he first took a look at anecdotal aspects of ostracism, talking to people about the silent treatment or the fact that they were ostracized. Um, what did they feel like? How did they feel? And he talks about the alienation that and its effects that people feel and what it can drive them to do. I mean, the Columbine. He talks about Columbine in the book, and that Columbine was these two young individuals in high school who were spurned, who were socially rejected by most of their peers in high school, and it drove them to very extreme actions because it threatened them to very core, essential emotional aspects of our well-being. And these young individuals, of course, everybody remembers what these individuals did, and it was tragic. I mean, because they lashed out at society, the society they knew, which was their peers in high school, and They hurt a lot of people who didn't necessarily have anything to do with any rejection that they were feeling. They were just lashing out at society arbitrarily. Uh, I mean, they meant to hurt, but they didn't necessarily care who they hurt. There have been instances where, in the Jehovah's Witnesses, where shunning has played an essential role. The magnitude to which the effects of shunning, the results are sometimes very powerful and very tragic. I can think of the uh, circumstance of a little more than a year ago of an Ann Arbor woman and her husband. They had grown up in the Jehovah's Witnesses, and they were disfellowshipped by their congregation. Now, I don't know the circumstances of the disfellowshipping, but those that were familiar with the situation uh, knew that it impacted her, the wife especially. Now, this was a young family. They had two kids that had gone to college. Her husband was a successful, I believe, programmer at University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and she herself had been a model and had some success in a career of modeling. But the rejection that they felt in the religion that they were certain was true. They were rejected and disfellowshipped for a long period of time, and it was like a pressure cooker. And the pressure built up more and more to the point where it drove her to uh, commit murder and suicide. She murdered her family, and she committed suicide. Now that is an extreme case, but it's not unexpected with shunning. Shunning is a tremendously destructive, emotionally destructive, manipulative tool. I don't even think that the eight governing body members really understand the implications of shunning. These are uneducated men who don't really understand what they're doing. They just know that shunning is a policy. It's something that works. It uses basically fear of compliance uh, as a mechanism to control the body of Jehovah's Witnesses into doing what the governing body wants them to do. I mean, it is a top-down matter where this is a matter of control, controlling the individuals and their actions, what they think, what they believe, and so it's a there's there's a definite intent that's being uh, utilized in the shunning policy. The there are other circumstances where shunning was led to the same result. I mean, there was a reference in one of the in that article about the Ann Arbor woman about a Jehovah's Witness family in South Carolina in 2014, where there was a similar murder suicide. Um, Long term shunning results in anger and the anger is very difficult to shed. There are different aspects, and I'm going to go through this in another video where we talk some of the factors involved in shunning, but just to talk about the effects is very important, and why it's these effects that lead to us really understanding why we need to understand shunning and its implications. Because trust me, it's not just those original. Or I'm sorry, it's starting to rain. It's not just those. It's not just those religions that have shunning as an official policy. Uh, Seth Andrews, he comes from a fundamentalist background, and he talks about the relationship with his parents. And there's an ostracism that is happening there. It happens in all religions, despite whether or not it is sanctioned officially as a policy, or as just in the disruption of individual relationships, as a child rejects their parents' religion. And so any shutdown of communication between them as a result of the disapproval of the parents to the child's action, and the cutting off of communication between them cuts off, because our emotions and our as human beings, it is our communication with one another that is so important in letting others know how we feel about them. When you cut that off, it cuts off all the feedback that we get about being wanted, of having any sense of value, of being needed. Um, it just shuts all that out, and individuals default to the idea of not wanting, not being wanted, not having any value, of no sense of belonging to the community or to the family. And it is so powerful. Kipling Williams goes into a number of anecdotes where abuse victims, where individuals who have experienced ostracism say that they would rather be beaten, and they mean this, that they'd rather be beaten than to experience ostracism, to experience being cut off by the community, by their family, by their religious sect. They they'd rather undergo brutality, whipping, physical abuse, verbal abuse, humiliation of that sort, and painful results uh, of the disapproval, than to experience the silent treatment. And we'll go into some of the reasons that are behind that factor, but it is true. There was these Kingdom Hall Kingdom Hall crashings that you see online, and you hear about, are a direct result of the shunning, where the individuals shunned are trying to take back the power that has been removed from them by being cut off. And it's a retaliatory aspect. It's because they are so connected. They haven't found a way of making up or finding another community to take the substitute emotionally, of the congregation within with most of these are born-ins who do that, and deep down in their subconscious, they are striking back. They're trying to take back the the control, the power that was removed from them when they were cut off, when they were ousted, and they're insisting, because one of the things that ostracism does, what shunning does, it makes the person invisible. It is as if you do not exist. This is the world as if you had died and nobody's there. You're talking, you're a ghost and nobody hears you. This is the world of the ostracized. And we humans are social creatures. We need social interaction to a great degree, to a much greater degree than anybody ever suspected. And when that's removed, we feel as if we're invisible, that we don't have any presence. And so that's trying to take back some of that control, some of these repercussions, the marching in and disrupting a kingdom hall is, I am here, I exist, I'm forcing you to acknowledge me. I'm a person and you can't ignore me. And that's what that is, because their community, their sense of need, their sense of belonging was so strong, and that was removed by the community that was important to them, that they are forcing that community to acknowledge their existence. And it's interesting to see that this happens with everybody. Everybody. I asked Lloyd. There was a recent video in which Lloyd Evans was interviewing somebody who had discussed his experience of being shunned. Now, apparently, in this particular situation, the person who was shunned, his father didn't just cut him off. His father and mother drove 3 hours from their home to confront him about his decision to leave the Jehovah's Witnesses. And when they found that there was no turning back, that this individual had made his decision that he was leaving the Jehovah's Witnesses, the father lost his temper and pushed his son essentially into a corner, yelling and screaming abusively at him, and then left. and and Lloyd, and I asked if I could use the clip. Lloyd agreed, but Lloyd's response was so interesting. He says, "I am insanely jealous," and I'll play that clip. In this interview that Lloyd was conducting, the individual he was interviewing recounted his experience with his parents when he announced that he was leaving the Jehovah's Witnesses. In this particular circumstance, the individual's parents drove 3 hours to confront their son about leaving the Jehovah's Witnesses and the mistake that they believed he was making, leaving the truth, and expressing to him and threatening to him the consequences of what his decision was ultimately going to mean. And apparently, the circumstance became quite heated, especially with the individual's father. And he got right up into the face of his son and was yelling at him and backed him into a corner. And this was a circumstance that was new between the two of them. They've never had any kind of a physical confrontation of that sort previously in their lives. Yet, during this, in this situation, during this circumstance, the father came all the way from where they lived. It was no small trek to confront him physically and verbally abuse him and threaten him. And Lloyd's response was classic because in his circumstance, there wasn't any confrontation. There wasn't any acknowledgement. There wasn't any effort to bring him back into the fold. It was just a retreat, as he called it, into silence, into shunning. And individuals who have experienced severe forms of shunning have expressed, and I'll be reading some of these anecdotal accounts from Kipling's book, Kip Williams' book. I wish I had been beaten so I would have bruises to show others, including the police, that I indeed was being abused. No one would believe that my husband could be so unkind, and there was nothing I could point to prove what he was doing. And this was a circumstance between husband and wife. Another individual recounted, I believe I would rather have received a belting every week than to endure the silent treatment, as I believed it ate at my soul. It has been a long road for me. I recall asking her for hiding at age 12 rather than endure another period of silence and the shocking atmosphere it created. For people who voice their preference for verbal or physical abuse over ostracism are not simply those who experience ostracism. Many people who have written us have experienced all forms of abuse, as is the case from a woman who wrote the following letter. My husband's way of being the master of the house, so to speak, was to totally ignore whenever your opinions differed to his. He walked around our home for weeks on end, not uttering a word to anyone, and I personally learned to react in return with this same cruel, unforgiving method. My husband not only used the silent treatment by not speaking to me, but he also used it by avoiding any bodily contact. That is, he would walk past you sideways so as not to touch you, slept on the lounge or in the car until you begged him not to. He refused to eat any meals, took away all financial support, and had bank accounts transferred into his own name, and allowed you no access to them. Refused you to use the car. This mental cruelty almost destroyed me and my family, and wasn't until I suffered a breakdown and spent 8 weeks in a hospital uh, undergoing psychotherapy that I came to the realization that the devastating effects of that I came to realize that devastating effects this treatment had on my life and those that I loved. My second husband, who was an alcoholic, used to physically abuse me, but the bruises and scars healed very quickly, and I believe that mental cruelty is far more damaging than a black eye, although any type of violence to me now is unacceptable. You see, one of the problems with shunning is it's a non-treatment. It differs in that there's nothing you can point to say this person is abusing me. You can't say he beat me and here's the evidence. There is no evidence of shunning. There is no evidence of ostracism. It's non-action. It is the it says it's a powerful weapon, and no one can accuse you of attack or violence or harassment, but the wounds are still afflicted. And so when you hear about people who are undergoing shunning, they would rather be abused. They'd rather be physically attacked or confronted in an abusive way because it acknowledges their existence. It acknowledges, as Lloyd pointed out in his discussion with this individual, that that there's some care, that there's some concern, that there's something between a bond that exists between the individuals, such that it was meaningful to the point where even abusive, let's say an abusive response or reaction, um, was demonstrative of that care, no matter how dysfunctional that demonstration was. It still shows some some care that the individual who is abusing you does you matter to them in some way, whether it is negative or positive. It's still not necessarily a healthy thing, but at the same time, you are somebody to them. Shunning, you're non-existent. You're gone. You do not exist, and you're a ghost without a voice. And so that is the terrible thing. And being such social creatures that we are, when we experience this, the torture, the emotional torture that we endure, that we undergo, is far more devastating and far more impactful than if we underwent physical abuse. And so it's a strange but interesting fact that shunning has this strong impact, and it's the stealth element to it that is so insidious. And we'll look at some of that a little bit more detail. And some of the experiments that were conducted. One of them was actually quite humorous, but it went on to demonstrate exactly what the impacts of shunning are. And the particular story recounted here, the study that was recounted here, was called the Scarlet Letter, and we'll go into that a little bit more detail. I think some pretty good points were made in that, even though it wasn't as much of a study as it was just a sort of a uh, it was a demonstration to help confirm some of the things that were the outcomes that came out of some official studies. Um, so we'll take a look at that. But anyway, I think that this is a tremendously important subject. I mean, to me, my family, even though the Bible students don't have an official shunning, and I wrote again. I mentioned I wrote to Kipling Williams about a couple things on in the book. Um, my family won't have anything to do with me. They won't talk to me. I haven't been in contact with my family for a long time, and that's because there's no question they're disapproving of my um, leaving the truth of the Bible students. We don't have anything in common. I've gone back into the world. I've left my heritage, and so there's nothing for us to speak. Um, Anything in common to speak about, which isn't true. I mean, there are many things that people can form relationships around other than religion. Religion really shouldn't be such a central point of people's lives. I think this is one of the reasons why, because it's so darn damaging. Um, but anyway, we'll take a look at this topic a little bit more closely. In the next segment, we'll look at some of the studies. We'll look at the model a little bit more closely that was developed by Kip Williams, and we'll look at some of the studies that were done. I think they were pretty ingenious, but the results really are quite incredible, actually. Uh, as was suggested by the interview that Lloyd Evans had done with a young man from University of Virginia who has looked at this subject. Um, he indicated that the studies look at the minimal impacts of shunning. For example, the Scarlet Letter study that's described in Kipling Williams' book, everybody expected the shunning to occur. They didn't know exactly when it was going to occur. It was somewhat arbitrary. It was done out of picking names out of a hat, but the fact was that the individuals involved were professionals. They knew some of the outcomes, and they kept a diary and a log of their experience of both being shunned and of shunning, and and they actually experienced strong emotional response, even though it was expected. And they knew that it wasn't permanent, that this was part of a study, and yet they still had the effects of shunning. And so this is not a trivial matter. This is not a trivial situation at all. So even at the most minimal, uh, when studies are conducted in such a way that they the cause is kept to a minimal level of impact, it still elicits very strong response. And that's and then in the uncontrolled situation where shunning is done uh, not in a controlled situation, but in real life, and done in a way that is to manipulate and actually hurt other individuals, uh, the effects are far stronger. like I said, in my own experience, it was so consuming, so black. I've never experienced anything quite like it since. I had a couple of experiences with it, as I explained, but the one in particular, the one experience in particular, was so strong and so overpowering, so overwhelming that it really did have an effect for the rest of my life. And I think ultimately it was the the incident or the circumstance that ultimately brought me to the situation I'm in today, which I am grateful. As my wife indicated at the time, she said, "Someday you'll look back at this and you'll be grateful that they didn't elect you an elder." She was absolutely right. At the time, though, it wasn't any comfort whatsoever to me. Um, but today, I see how right she is and was, um, and that that I'm much happier today, much happier. It's I can't even compare the my life today, even in the darkest circumstances, doesn't compare at all to my experiences with the Bible students when they meant something to me. So anyway, this is Truth Seeker, wishing you all the best, and we'll go into a little more detail in this subject. I think that there is a lot more, and I encourage anybody who is undergoing shunning to take a look at this topic and try to remove themselves from the emotional aspect and look at it from a an objective point of view, an outside point of view. Get whatever resources. Begin with some of the YouTube videos of shunning. Kipling Williams, in particular, who was the pioneer and foremost expert in this area, and also take take a look at some of the articles in Psychology Today. Do a search on shunning in Psychology Today. They'll refer to Kipling Williams and his work, but many of the articles are quite interesting. So I suggest you read those. The book is a little bit more intense. Actually it's a little harder to read. It's more of it's not light reading. It's kind of it's more of a it's almost a thesis. It's really to more for those with a scientific background or bent. But I do recommend it because there are some very good anecdotal stories, and even if some of the studies are a little harder to comprehend, it's still worth reading because some of the studies do indicate pretty plainly how strong an effect um, being left out, being cut off, being rejected does to a person. Very powerful. That's why he calls it the power of silence. So anyway, this is Truth Seeker here, wishing you all the best, and we'll return to the subject soon. Thank you.